Thank you, everyone, for coming to the seminar today. And we are very pleased to have Jonathan Touboul providing a lecture for us. Some background for Jonathan is that he received a PhD in mathematics from École Polytechnique in Paris. Currently, he is a professor and the chair of the Brandeis Mathematics Department. Some of his main interests are application of tools from dynamical systems and stochastic processes. And he researches in areas such as mathematics, biology, such as ecology, and neuroscience, such as visual cortex activities. And we look forward to hearing about his study of type 3 excitable neurons.
All right. So much. So that was a little last minute. So I put together a bunch of slides about some old and new work on the dynamics of neurons, and mostly about dynamical structures and geometry of the invariant of the dynamical system and how these can explain or account for specific behaviors that we see in actual neurons. And so my objective will be to give you some background about these ideas, and then trying to get to my most recent work, which we submitted for the new year, actually, at SIAM with joint work with John Rubin and Justina Signerska, who was my postdoc before, and it's going to be about type 3 neurons. But before that, I'll tell you a little more about this hybrid dynamical system, which kind of like not. So this is basically the approach. The approach is that some people out there with dressed in white are kind of looking at actual neurons, and they draw graphs and working on the blackboard, and we write simple equations, as simple as possible, trying to reproduce what is observed. And the interest for that, there are really two words in modeling neurons. There are this very detailed model where the theoretician is kind of trying to incorporate in their model as many elements as they can about the actual phenomena that happen in biology. And this leads to very detailed models that are very often, more often than not, impossible to study mathematically, but that we can simulate with the computer. And the interest of these models is really that you may be able to predict quantitatively predict the dynamics of a neuron in response to specific changes in biophysical parameters or ionic concentrations. And what I like is just trying to take the simplest equation I can and trying to understand how general the observations are made are across a wide class of neurons and models, and how they are related to properties in mathematics. All right, so I don't know how much I need to say about these kind of dynamics of neurons. Yeah, probably I can speak a little. This is the Hodgkin X-ray model. Okay, how do we simplify this? So of course, these are all different types of neurons, and they differ in the way they respond to input. This is pretty important in this study. So actually, in the 40s, Alan Hodgkin, who got the Nobel Prize for the Hodgkin X-ray model and the observation of spikes in the giant squid axon. So he proposed essentially that neurons fall into three classes. that are called types also of class. And they fall into three classes depending on the way they respond to steps of current. So here it's not Hodgkin classification. It's a little more subtle, but it's still, you can see these are individual neurons responding to a step of current. So what Hodgkin said, he just looked at, just considered three classes according to the way neurons respond to a step of current as the amplitude of the step changes. So type 1 neuron, class 1 neurons, are neurons that remain silent for small. I mean, all neurons remain silent for small input, but after a specific threshold, starts responding with spikes with arbitrarily low frequencies. Okay, so right when you exceed the minimal value for the input, you start firing. And so you can sustain a wide range of frequencies, but also you can sustain very slow. Type 2 neurons also have a threshold and are able to respond regularly, but they cannot sustain slow firing. So they have a discontinuous Fi curve. And typically the range of frequencies, I mean, at least Hodgkin describes it like that, the range of frequency that can be sustained is smaller. All right. In type 3 neurons, they never respond tonically to inputs. So what happens in a type 3 neuron is that when you turn on the input, depending on the amplitude of that input, the response will be phasic spiking. Very good return to this. Whatever amplitude you present to the neuron, you will have same type of phasic response, a specific number of spikes, and then return to rest. Okay. So type 1 and 2 have been the most studied in computational neuroscience and by mathematicians also. The main reason I would say is that they very nicely correspond to two types of bifurcations in a dynamical system. I'm going to come back to that. So all of that is textbook material, maybe. It's to see. But so type 1 neuron are typically associated with a saddle node bifurcation, where initially you have stable fixed point. As you increase the input, you get the loss of these fixed points, and then now trajectories are going to spike. They're going through a region where the vector field is almost zero. Okay, so the derivative of the system around here is almost zero. It's very, very slow. Typically, you generate very, very slow responses. Okay, so this typically related to a Hopf bifurcation. Okay, so you go from, let's say, that looks like that to something that looks like that, where this fixed point becomes unstable. Now, here you have some frequency, the minimal frequency solutions. The vector field is never zero. It's just complex rotating around. All right, so this original frequency is related to the imaginary part of the eigenvalues at the value. Okay, so this is that. And here, well, You don't have the bifurcation. No bifurcation. Why you don't have a bifurcation? Well, because whatever parameter you choose, you just keep the fixed. I mean, this fixed point changes, right? This equilibrium, if I maintain my step of current, I will have variety of fixed point. But essentially, in terms of the bifurcation diagram, you will just have the fixed point. No bifurcation. Whereas here you would have a saddle node. Here you will have a lot. Typically, we're talking about subfood. Okay. So I want to really be involved here. I mean, I'm at home, all right? And so maybe I want to jump to type 3 and tell you why I'm interested in that. Maybe I'll give you just a little bit of background about the models I have. Okay.
Very naive question. So these like bursting neurons, is that like associated with some specific type, or can that be any type?
Bursting is typically needs 3 variables, and it's typically associated. So there's a pretty good paper by Eugene Zikiewicz. It's a 100-page paper with a bunch of very geometrical analysis. But typically for bursting, you need a slow variable. Sorry. Yeah. You need a slow variable and 2 fast. And it's typically associated with the slow passage, with relaxation cycles. So relaxation cycles are typically, hysteresis when you have a slow variable. So imagine my slow variable. Imagine this is a null line somehow. Whatever is below this null line moves to the right, whatever is above moves to the left. This is slow, so if you start here, move to down. Okay. So bursting is typically associated with having limit cycles over there in this region. Okay. So typically a little more structural. That's kind of the typical way. The paper by Zikiewicz looks at all the different types of families of limit cycles you can have, typical types of, like how they disappear, maybe with a homoclinic, maybe with a Hopf, maybe they appear with 2 Hopf, like an egg, like that, and what are the different types of geometrical curves.
So this is somehow outside of this.
But it's not exactly. So typically, I would say that if you're able to, and here I'm talking, maybe somebody else knows better than me. But if the frequency of the burst can be as low as low as possible, you would still have type 1 excitability. And if there's a minimal frequency, you would have type 2 excitability. And the structure, Hodgkin didn't look at that. Actually, the axon he was looking at is not burst. But it has to do with frequency, count of slides. Over question. All right, let's go quick through the type of models I want to look at. And they also have nice systems. So instead of looking at all so Hodgkin and Huxley, they wrote a very detailed model, which is still the gold standard of neuron models, where they kind of include the ion channels and how they get open and closed, and typically it's nonlinear equations. 4-dimensional, for the original one, but usually people add more channels and things like that. But even the 4-dimensional is not, you cannot have an analytical study because you cannot essentially write an expression for the fixed point. It's kind of very hard to study. But anyway, Lapik. So this is Louis Lapik. In 1900, 1901, I think, he proposed a model, a simplified model of neuron that retains essentially the spikes, but abstracts completely the nonlinearities. So, so what's interesting, this model was proposed before Hodgkin today, before we knew much about neurons. It's kind of a very simple model where you have this linear differential equation. This one, V would be your voltage, I is your input, and you have a threshold data. So your fixed point here, I didn't put any time constant, I absorbed it in my equation. So typically your fixed point is, if I is constant, fixed point is V equals I, and as I is equal reaches theta, you start spiking, okay? And you start spiking with very slow, very low. So this is typically a type 1 neuron. It's very, very easy to study, really. I already solved it in front of you. It's very easy. But it has a very limited repertoire of what it can generate. Type of behaviors it can generate. It's also not very realistic. In the late 80s, Barnum and Trout and Nancy Couple, they slightly generalized that. They introduced the nonlinearity here. V squared V dot equals V squared plus I. And so now it's a nonlinear system. It also blows up in finite time for everyone. Knows what it means? Something that doesn't have a real threshold. You don't fix the threshold for the voltage. This will go to infinity very fast. And that will define your spikes. And then you reset. This is still simple. Drop the threshold. You have very fast spike initiation. So for the linear integrated fire, this would be your solution. For the quadratic integrated fire, you don't have a threshold, and your solution is to supplement. Then they get constant. That looks better. Looks more like spike initiation. It's also quite limited in terms of report. It's also called the theta model, theta neuron, because you can wrap infinity, you can wrap this around the circle by including infinity and identifying infinity and VR, and write an equation for that. It's a very, very nice model that you can study. And the type of bifurcation that it has is called a SNCC. So essentially you saddle node on an invariant circle, where you start from dynamical system that has a stable fixed point. Do it the overlay, because it's overlay. So it has a stable fixed point and a stable one. As you increase the inputs, those two fixed points get closer and further together, they merge at a SNCC, saddle node on an invariant circle. Then they disappear, and now you rotate and you just generate your cycles, and it's also type 1. Okay, because when this disappears, you have theta dt equals 0. So it's going to get very, very slow. Right? But that was really a step in the right direction. In 2000, Eugene Itzkevich proposed a model that is a slight generalization of this model, except that it adds a second dimension. Yeah, progress was slow. Okay, so maybe we don't put that on YouTube. Okay. Well, what was pretty impressive. So that paper in 2000 by Itzkevich was really exciting when I was doing my thesis, because this very simple model is actually generating a lot of behaviors. So essentially what it has added is this variable W. Okay? And what happens with that variable W is the following. So you still have this explosion possible, but when V increases, W increases as well. I mean, A and B are positive. So kind of the dynamical equilibrium for W would be BV. So W increases and it can prevent V from falling. But all of that depends on your parameters, on the input and all of this. So it's actually a very simple model. Nonlinearity is just quadratic. And but let me tell you why it's complicated is we still have this absence of thresholds. So when V goes to infinity, you have a spike, you reset the voltage, and the adaptation is actually not reset completely. It's adjusted, okay, as a linear adjustment. It looks very simple. What's complicated in this model is that it's what we call hybrid dynamical system. It's not a continuous dynamic. I mean, if there was just this equation, of course, you can study that very soon. But this combines nonlinear dynamic, nonlinear ODEs, and discrete reset. So it's kind of very rich because you have these two components. Okay. And quite interestingly, in 2006, Romain with Wolfram Gerstner, they proposed a variant of this model, which they thought was better, more realistic. But I mean, so I simplified a lot. But instead of V squared, I have this exponential V minus V, which really, when V is small, is just a V squared. Okay. But they were kind of competing at the time when I started my thesis, and I got excited about this, trying to understand what was of dynamics. So yeah, so all of that I said. So let me tell you. Yeah. Let's go relatively quickly on that. So essentially, you can study both of these systems under the same framework. Just remove, I mean, because the only difference is this. Nonlinearity, I'll just make it F of V, and I just want them to be similar. In the following sense, I want it to be regular, so I can talk about singularities. I want it to be strictly convex, so I'm going to have the same number of fixed points, and then also to get the same number of fixed points, you want somehow that the slope is infinite here, and the slope is larger than. Okay, so you have two conditions, and under that, you can prove that all of these models have the same type of bifurcation. They have the saddle node bifurcation. Yeah.
So on the last slide, there's the A something minus √2, like one side goes to infinity, and the other side it's less than something which is with that.
Yeah, so it's gonna be for that bifurcation pattern, for the Hopf bifurcation. So you want somehow enough slope. In the V square and in the exponential V minus V, slopes are sufficient, but you want the minimal slope to generate the Hopf bifurcation. Otherwise, the bifurcation diagram would be different. You can still solve it, but it's just going to be a different class. So I just wanted the largest class that would allow me to have the same data. Essentially, you have this Hopf bifurcation, so hopefully type 1 excitability right here. Then you create these two fixed points. You can still generate spikes here. When the stable fixed point can undergo the Hopf bifurcation and generate these unstable cycles. And there have a stable fixed point. So you go from 0 fixed point to 2 unstable fixed points to one stable, one unstable fixed point, and an unstable limit cycle. 2, one stable, one unstable fixed point, no unstables. Okay, so that's kind of the bifurcation diagram for all of these. And this is a saddle homotopy. So it's a homotopy bifurcation. This limit cycle grows, collapses with the fixed point, and then vanishes. So you can prove that rigorously. I mean, you have formulas for each of these curves. You can actually find that they're very similar. What they didn't find was that the type of Hopf bifurcation. So you have 2 types of Hopf bifurcations. I actually already mentioned that. You have these subcritical, and you have supercritical Hopf bifurcation. And they depend, I mean, the difference is the type of limit cycles that they generate. They either generate stable limit cycles that wrap around the unstable part branch of the fixed point, or unstable fixed points that wrap around the stable part. Okay. And so there's a condition that you can derive for the passive models that tells you what's the type of Hopf bifurcation. So the sign of this term is the same sign as the Lyapunov coefficient for the Hopf. So whether it's negative or positive will tell you what type. If you have f to be quadratic, this is 0, this is 2. And so the sign is positive. It's b minus a for b bigger than. If you take exponential, this will be exponential b. This will be exponential b squared. This whole thing is positive also. So the quadratic and the exponential models have exactly the same dynamics, but it's pretty obvious that you could find n that could satisfy your conditions, but would change the type of the Hopf bifurcation. Okay. Typically, you just need f triple prime of v to be negative, because for b close to a, this will definitely be positive, multiplied by a square. But if f triple prime is negative, then this will change sign as you change b. Okay. So essentially, yeah. So that's what I propose. Propose a very simple model where the sign of a changes, and now you have a little more dynamics, which are these self-sustained oscillations, which are not in the quadratic and not in the exponential model, and that are exactly associated with this branch of green solutions. So now you can look at what you can generate. Okay, definitely generate tonic spiking, phasic spiking, regular bursting, basic bursting, class 1 excitability, class 2 excitability. You can also generate very interesting responses to transient input. Spike latency, subthreshold oscillations, resonator behaviors, where you present 2 spikes, 2 inputs. These are the same input, these little squares, are the same input, but depending on how you time them, the neuron will either respond to them or not. The integrator, now the neuron really wants coincidence detection. Spike at the same time. And then you have also rebound property. Right? When you put negative input, you can rebound with a spike, with a burst. Post-inhibitory facilitation, you present an input that doesn't trigger a spike, but if you prime the neuron with a negative input, then you generate a spike. By stability, things like that. And so the self-sustained oscillations are only seen in this kind of quartic model, the one that I. So I've done a bunch of work to try and understand each and every one of these cases. So I guess now I can just jump to the transient responses. Unless you have questions. Yeah.
Like your model is 2-dimensional.
Yeah.
How do you get the
Because it's okay, let's do that. Yeah, because I mean the quick answer is that because it's hybrid, it has it's hybrid, yeah. As it becomes new. Let me explain how this goes. So that's a good example of the type of analysis that I've been doing. So the idea to understand bursting is the following. So So what happens to your model is, okay, so let's assume that you don't have any. Start from, this is the reset line. Let's say you start below the reset line, you blow up in finite time in V, W doesn't blow up. So you reach this, this point, and then you get reset, right? And then you get reset and reset again. Now this should be key, I mean, so Kino took the freedom to remove my Greek, but it's, so you can define this function that is actually a discrete map that will tell you if you started on the reset line at this point, where did you go? Okay, so now it's a purely discrete dynamical system that will tell you after a reset, where do you go? Okay, so that's a map. And it has a domain of definition that will depend on the bifurcations on the dynamical properties of the continuous dynamical system. So if you have a stable fixed point, I think there's the next slide here that will show that, yeah. So definition domain may be the whole real line. So in that case, your reset map is defined everywhere because from everywhere you would span. Here, it's defined everywhere except in the attraction the sound of it. So the reset map will only be defined quickly there. It's not defined here, because if you start here, you go to the fixed point, you never span. Okay, so this is the case where it's you remove an interval, this is the case where you remove half plane. This is the case that I love, but I don't think I have time to tell you about that, where you have actually the stable manifold here of the saddle fixed point. And each time the reset line fits the red, will go to the fixed point. So actually you're defined everywhere except on a finite number of points. Okay, and that generates very complicated behaviors. But anyway, so what the bottom line is that if you reset map, so this phi, if phi has a stable fixed point, then it's probably here, yeah. So what you can prove also is that the map always looks like that. It's always increasing until you hit the V now line, and then it decreases, and it has a horizontal asymptote. It always looks like that. And with that, you know that you have a unique for any model that you take, improve now. And so then everything depends on the properties of the fixed point. If you have a stable fixed point, converge to this fixed point, not regular spike. There's a little subtlety about where the fixed point is and the behavior, but you can find, I mean, rigorous conditions on the properties where this is true. And then if you have a periodic orbit for the reset map, then now you're doing 1, 2, 3 slides reset, 1, 2, 3 slides reset. So you generate this first. Okay. So that's really a periodic orbit in a discrete system. Okay, and of course you have all the complexity of these discrete systems with, you know, period doublings, chaos, things like that. Okay, so this is just changing a parameter. It is it's a reset VR. And we have the whole period adding cascade, which I actually rigorously prove at some point, but I'm gonna skip that now. You can prove a rigorous. Yeah. All right. Yeah, let me skip that. You can rigorously prove this sequence of period doublings. I'm tempted to, okay. Okay, let me tell you that because I think it's exciting and I found 10 minutes, 15 minutes ago. Let me go quick about it. So in your bifurcation diagram, there's the region of the parameters where the system has two unstable fixed points, one saddle and one unstable fixed point, and an unstable force. And so the stable manifold of the saddle wraps around them. Okay, so it spirals Okay, and then the unstable manifold is just going to the left, and then it's spiking somewhere. So what's interesting here is that you spike from everywhere because nothing goes to a fixed point except on the red line. And the red line, so when you have your reset line intercepting the red line, it's divided into sectors. Each sector is related to the number of times you wrap around the spread. Okay, come back. Yeah. Oh, no. This red trajectory.
Sharon.
Yes, yeah. You need to share. Yeah. Let's go.
Turn on Zoom. Let's see her. Good. Sure.
All right. All right. This is something the blue. Here, you just start. You start on the green. You turn, you spike. If you turn on the pink, you do 2 turns and spike. You start on the pink, actually, you do half a turn and then 3 turns. 3.5. Okay. So actually your reset line kind of distinguishes between the number of small oscillations you make before going to a spike. And what else is interesting, I think, in the system is that when you approach the red line from below, the trajectory will track the red line and will spike a little piece. When you're just above, the trajectory will track the red line, but from inside of a long time, even if you start time. So every time you cross the red line, you have a discontinuity of the reset line, of the reset map. And this discontinuity has very specific left and right limits. Right? So your reset line is exactly, your reset map, this is P. Now it's broken into small pieces. And the left and the right limits are prescribed, except, of course, in the middle, because we don't intersect the red line. So that led us with my postdoc Justina to study the dynamics of these discontinuous maps and trying to generalize some of the results about bifurcations of these discontinuous maps. And essentially, you can really construct very complicated behaviors with the Devil staircase periods and things like that. These are classical dynamical systems trajectories, except that they are. The fun part was that we were showing that in a discontinuous map. Anyway, so skipping that, I eventually can start my talk. So these are the 3 types. Excitability, we talked about that already, but you didn't see the face of Alan Hodgkin. So this is Alan Hodgkin. Let me tell you about the kind of behaviors that have been reported for type 3 neuron. And maybe instead of looking at the text, let me draw it for you. So type 3 neurons are observed in a variety of regions in the brain, and there are very specific functions. They're crucial in different signal processing. They're particularly observed in the auditory system, and it's assumed, or it's considered, that they serve functions like coincidence detection and very delicate spike timing detection. Okay, so they don't spike just when you present enough input. They just spike in response to they select the time profile of the input that will generate spike. And so in these reviews, we kind of focus on 4 properties of these type 3 neurons. And we are working on each of them with John Rubin and Justin. So post-inhibitory facilitation, I already showed you that. To present a specific stimulus to the neuron, excitatory stimulus, it will not spike. So you present a subspatial stimulus, doesn't spike, but your neuron would spike if you primed it with an inhibition. Okay, slope detection is kind of interesting also. So your neuron, so let's say now, so post-inhibitory facilitation would be negative followed by positive input. So this is your input as a function of time. And you would generate a spike or not depending on the timing of this. Okay. Slope detection. Now, what I'm going to focus on to have like rigorous results is 10 inputs. So these 10 inputs, they have a clear slope. Okay. Going to have the same slope up and down. And I'm going to also, so you have different ways in which you can normalize this. You don't want your input to just be larger or just have a larger area. What we did was maintain the total current, so the integral of that, so the surface area of your parameter. And so slope detection will tell you that as a function of your slope, this will be called beta. As a function of beta, you don't spike, then you spike. All right, this is just a quick drawing, but so your neuron will be able to detect a specific range of slopes. Phase looking is pretty interesting. This is what we just put on archive, and we're still working on that. And this is apparently related to binaural audition and the localization of sounds in space. So if you have a sound, you can locate it, right? This is related to the difference of timing when you receive this sound wave. And so slope detection is actually looking at our neurons tuned to a specific difference in the timing of an input. Okay, when you have noise. So when you present two inputs separated by a specific difference, do they code that difference in the spike time or are they spiking? This is kind of tricky because it's new, it requires input. And coincidence detection, which is more of an integration. So if you have multiple inputs coincident at a specific time, you would spike, but not if they are not coincident. So let's just look at pictures, okay? And then, so what happens when you have, so let's start with post-inhibitory facilitation. Assume that you have start presenting an inhibitory signal. So this is, so this is a quadratic integrated fire neuron, if you will. And I made this straight line. I made it completely vertical. So now I can move up and down however I want. I will not lose my fixed spot. And I will not change the stability. Okay, so this is the type 3 neuron. Okay. And you can see two values of your input. So this is your fixed point here. You present an inhibitory input. You move the null line, if you will, down here. And now your system wants to converge to this fixed point. Then you turn it off, and then it returns to your fixed point. So post-inhibitory facilitation would be associated to this kind of spiraling solutions where you can kick at the right time to generate the spike that wouldn't have occurred without the inhibition. Okay, does that make sense? I think with this geometric interpretation, it's pretty simple to see. And so this is my parameterization. I have my inhibition, then an excitation, the specific duration. Okay, and then I have a time. Okay, so delta is the duration of the pulse, And TE is the time at which you stop. You can see that you have possibility facilitation. You said that there exists a range of time in TE for which you will respond this type of input. But if you go too fast or too slow, you don't. Okay, so, and this is kind of a sequence of trajectories. So you can see this is your inhibition, this is your excitation running away. Then you can see that it doesn't spike, then suddenly it spikes, and then it doesn't.
Sorry, I just didn't catch how you get the spiking, because in the previous slide, you showed how the fixed point is maintained regardless of
Yeah,
what you do with the second log line.
I mean, that's part of the,
How
yeah,
you get the spikes?
that's part of the proof, but yeah. So assume, so okay, so that, no, but let's keep with the pictures, okay? So you put the, you switch to the red line. You're here, then turn off. Return to the blue line. And then you have your excitatory phase. So now you switch to an outline that will be higher. So now the question is, when you are at a specific position of your return trajectory, are you in the spiking region or not? Okay, are you, so I'm gonna put here another outline, I'm gonna have a separatrix. And if these separatrix intersect that trajectory, I'm gonna have a spike. So that's how we prove it, and that's how we can find conditions for post-inhibitory facilitation. That's also why it's not as simple as if you shoot here, you get it. If you here, you get it. But in the middle, you don't. Not as simple as that. It's only the front line that is relevant in that case. All right. So anyway, we can prove things. For the slope detection, I'm gonna also go to a movie. Hopefully it's working. I'm trying, I mean, we can prove this. So imagine, so now I have my triangular input. So this is a very slow input going up and down. You're not spiking here because it's too slow, you're just writing it. You have this intermediate value, you can see that it barely catches that. Really. Just above the threshold, try to catch it those values. You're going way too fast. You're also stopping. Right. So you can prove these theorems. You can prove that you have specific slopes for which. I mean, but the basic of the proof is here in this movie. You can prove that if you're slow enough, you're going to stay near the fixed point close enough so you will not spike. If you're too fast, you're going very high, we're going to spike. Great. If you're too fast here, you're going to move, you won't have time to move too far. It's going to come back before you have time to move too far. Okay, so the regimes are the following. If you move very slow, you're tracking the fixed point as it goes up and down. If you move very fast, an outline will suddenly be here, you want to stop. But because it's the same slope up and down, you're coming back very fast and you're catching it. So it will stop moving to the spike, but already you're back in the attraction list. And so then the whole thing is, do you have the slope for which it spikes? Okay, and is it monotonic? We can prove for all of the models. But I mean, the geometric intuition is what we can share here. Then for the slope, and then for the slope detection, what we're working on for the phase looking, what we're working on right now is really, and I have other slides for that, because I didn't have time to put all of that in. So this is kind of the superposition of different inputs. And this is phase up. Let's see. So this was part of the paper by Ringzel and other paper and other people, sorry, where they show, let's say that type 3 is able to do phasic spiking, whereas type 2 neurons for the same input are not phase up. They can spike at any point in time for the same input. We don't agree with that. It's actually it depends more on parameters and dynamical structures that you can have. I mean, you can have both cases in both situations. And so what we do now, so if you have the classical dynamical system, it's like move model, for instance, very classically, you have a fixed point here, and you have separatrix. If your input is too high, goes fast, okay? And we know how to compute this separatrix. It's a solution of the dynamical system. It's a particular solution of the dynamical system. Here, we have an input in addition to that. And so the whole idea that we're developing in the paper is to define a threshold that depends on the input. So now imagine this is your solution in response to an input with two sine waves, okay? So this is your original fixed point, and then you adjust. Yeah. Just receive your input. What we define as the instantaneous or the dynamical threshold is if you freeze your system at any point in time, remove it, and then turn the system back on with the input, okay? So you're taking your solution, move, and then turn the input back on, will it spike or not? And so now you generate a curve that may be above or below the original spike threshold. And this depends on the future of your input. So that's what is complicated, is that you may be very high above the threshold, but if your input is very negative after that, you won't spike. Okay? So anyway, that defines a curve, a unique curve that you can really define computationally. And we're working on actually characterizing these. They are solutions of the dynamical system to run backward the system. When if you start very far away along the threshold and run the solution backward, you get this threshold. But anyway, all of our study is related to introducing this dynamical threshold, like kind of a generalization of the instantaneous threshold. And now, so now phase locking will be related to the sharpness and depth of trough in your dynamical threshold. So these are the spike distributions for a given input, where you have a very sharp trough. And so now you have this type of very sharp loop. And then you may also have two troughs. You will have spike distributions that are very well treated. And then you may also have
You assume the inputs would be the same?
Sorry?
Are the two inputs the same? Or can they be?
Of input are the blue ones. This is the same parameters for the system, but the input is unique and there is noise. So that's why I have a distribution of spans. And so with that, so in the paper, we explain how to compute this dynamical threshold. And then we show that you can have both types of dynamical threshold profiles for type 2 and type 3 neurons. And we also show that it's enough to know the dynamical threshold. So this is kind of the important figure is that if you simulate a white noise model to hit the dynamical threshold, you generate spike distribution that is really close to the nonlinear system. So the whole information is actually contained in this dynamical threshold. All right. And then yeah, you can see how if you take the parameters of the result paper, you can move from type 2 to type 3 and how they got from a very sharp trough to a very flat curve for their parameters. And so we move conclusively from one to the other. You can really do things that, yeah, you can really generate the whole range of responses. All right, so our current research is really to try and understand how we can characterize mathematically those dynamical thresholds as solutions of the dynamical system. And we can compute applications. But yeah, try to give my research, but that's kind of. Yeah.
So given you have all this rich behavior, like a this way of like illustrating the behaviors, do you get a sense of robustness as well of like, I mean, of these behaviors, this in your model, which are the kind of ones that are sort of robust to changes in parameters? Are there some, because I mean, especially with these like mixed mode oscillations, I mean, is that very sensitive to like if we change parameters ever so slightly, then does this disappear?
Specifically for mixed mode oscillations, no. Because let me go back to the bifurcation diagram. Here, I guess, yeah. So in this whole region, you have your twin. Sorry, in this whole, yeah, no, in this whole region, you have twin solutions. In this whole region, you have mixed modes. But it's difficult to generate in the mixed mode oscillations. And what was, really part of our work trying to understand that was that nothing tells you that you're gonna be in different regions of the space. Okay, yes, if I force my system to start from between, I go with it. Then afterward you go, then you go bring us back. And so we have a theorem that is pretty fun, but it's actually telling us that I don't know if it talks about robustness, but you can actually okay. It's very particular that you have these two movies. And actually, you can look at the pre-image. So okay. So if you make this interval AB invariant, so you can have conditions for that. And the whole interval AB is mapped for each of these lines. And actually, you can prove that you have sequences that can generate any signature of the mixed mode solution. Because you can move from this interval to this interval, back to this interval, back to this interval, because they map the whole interval onto itself. So it's an intersection of non-empty intervals. So you can generate any finite signature. If you give me an infinite signature, then maybe I have just one thing. Yeah. I mean, at least I don't know if it tells you about the robustness, but it tells you that it exists for all systems.
Question about the slope detention. You mentioned when you're applying these like shaped signals, changing the slope, changing the signal such that total like charge is conserved with the area on the events and concerned. Do you see anything different if you choose to change the signal differently? If you could fix the peak amplitude and then just change the duration of it?
So if you, the answer is yes. You have different profiles for the different parameterizations. If you don't renormalize at all, you don't have a finite range of it. So let's say you fix the slope go up and down, but then no, you change the slope, but keep the duration constant. Then when you increase the slope, you will be on for a much longer amount of time, and that will not be monotony. As you increase the slope, you will just start firing the blues. But that's another phenomenon that's so good. It's also that you just give more energy to this. And we wanted to get rid of that. But yeah. Yes. Because I mean, then the question is, how do you test the slope independently of the other parameters? That's kind of, we had this debate a lot when we were writing the paper. Because slope is not independent of the others. And so my input changes amplitudes and duration. Yeah.
With your new neural model, with the, fourth power, is that captures some of the big three excitatory behavior better?
And it still captures type 3, but type 3 is more related to B, to the slope of your null line. So if, yeah. The only thing that it allows is non-bent solution, so self-sustained solution. So it's only generating this table in itself. But all the rest, it generates all the rest. Actually, all of these are generated by the form model, but you can also generate them with the quadratic. But the pink one cannot be generated by. But so essentially what you need for type 4, for type 3 is this kind of invariance of the stability of the fixed point upon changes of the input. So as long as this is a straight line, or if it's tilted backward, we will keep this fixed point stable. If you have ideas about these problems, I'm always excited to talk about that. And there's a bunch of other questions we can study. So